Welcome to Four Quarter Lives, a podcast exploring the profound impact of longer lives and careers on everything: countries, companies, couples, and careers. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's Four Quarter Lives, I talk with Marc Freedman, founding faculty director of Yale's Experienced Leadership Initiative, or ELI, and co-founder and co-CEO of CoGenerate. For more than 4 decades, Marc has been at the forefront of movements that connect generations, support midlife transitions, and reimagine later life as a time of purpose and contribution. We talk about his pioneering work from Experience Core to encore.org to CoGenerate, and his role in launching Yale's midlife leadership program, ELI. In this conversation, the concluding one of our series on different longevity and midlife programs in higher ed, I asked Marc to step back and explain why he thinks we're in the midlife 1.0 stage and where we're headed next. He shares an insightful overview of what makes midlife education work, the imperative of intergenerational connection, and why we need to redesign higher education for a 100-year life. Marc, welcome to Four Quarter Lives. I'm delighted to have you.
Avivah, it's such a joy to be here to talk to you and to be part of Four Quarter Lives, which is one of my favorite podcasts. So I'm honored.
Well, and I'm so delighted to be ending this series with you because I think, Marc, you have been, if anyone has been, you've been at the forefront of midlife and intergenerational movements of all kinds for almost your entire career, which is now stretching quite long, right?
Yes.
Share with us, how do you describe your trajectory across all these decades and all these roles with a pretty strong red line, I think?
Yeah, it was unanticipated because I started out focused on young people and the needs particularly of children growing up in poverty, and especially the power of relationship in human development, and particular development of young people. And it occurred to me early on that a lot of the programs that were designed to provide these supportive ties for young people, mentoring programs being the most obvious example, were struggling to find human beings who could do the things that only people could do. And meanwhile, there's this vast and growing older population, and it just seemed like there was a win-win hovering around the idea of connecting older people to younger people in mutually beneficial relationships, which then led to the creation of Experience Core, which is a program that just celebrated its 30th anniversary. I created that with John Gardner, who was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare during the Great Society, and who came up with the Experience Core name, and Linda Freed, who's the Dean of the Public Health School at Columbia. It's now in 25 cities around the country, and the entire focus really is on building bonds between the generations.
Like, how old were you when you did that?
Yeah, I often think of myself as I was a young person interested in young people, and older people were a vehicle for supporting younger people. But now I'm an older person. I'm still interested in young people, but also older people. And one of the striking features of Experience Core, which then led to the next 15 years of work for me and for our organization, was that they weren't just passing through. A lot of programs here in the United States, like City Year, Teach for America, these service programs that have become so popular with young people, are a year or two between college and grad school or high school and university. But the Experience Core members stayed an average of 10 years, and they essentially had a second career that wasn't as long as their first, but weighed as much, was as significant. It gave us the idea of an encore career, a second act for the greater good. We did research which showed that there were already 4.5 million older people in encore careers, but 21 million more wanted to follow in their footsteps. It was a top priority. And they too anticipated staying about 10 years. So when you added those numbers up and multiplied by 10, it's 250 million years of human and social capital, those things that only human beings could do, that could be applied to the great problems of the day. So as an organization, we changed our name to encore.org. And we've focused on this Encore career idea for 15 years, started the Purpose Prize, the Encore Fellows Program. But in recent years, we've returned to our founding mission, which is around connecting the generations, and changed our name again, this time to CoGenerate, because co is the Latin word for together. And it's focused on particularly older and younger people coming together to solve problems, bridge divides, foster bonds, and co-create a better future for everybody.
So are you actually saying that you've kind of done the same thing for 40 years under 3 different brands? Or has
Yes.
actually changed or evolved over that time in its mission?
I would say that your first statement is actually true. And sometimes I think
why bother changing? Just rebrand.
Exactly. It's really been a shift in emphasis over time. But, I would say it's longer than 40 years because for me personally, having older people in my life as a young person was transformative. When I went to university, I was a bad student. I was ill-prepared. In my first 2 years, I had 9 incomplete courses. And in order to get an incomplete course at the college I was at, you had to fill out a form and get the professor's permission. And then you had to go see a wizened 70-something older dean, a guy by the name of Gilmore Stott.
Oh my gosh,
and I had to go see him so many times that we became lifelong friends. And he became kind of my older mentor. So this has been, and I mentioned John Gardner and the creation experience for John Gardner was in his 80s. I was in my 30s. There was a half a century difference between the two of us. It seems like every juncture in my life when I was at a crossroads or conundrum, an older person would materialize. And I'm still at 67 looking for older people to play that role. I realize I should maybe be playing that role for somebody else.
Both and, right? I think it's
both and, yes.
And
I agree.
So how did you end up designing or being the founding faculty of Yale's Experienced Leadership Initiative, or ELI? How does that fit into this narrative?
It's somewhat happenstance. I actually attended the Yale School of Management for my MBA from 1982 to 1984. So I guess that is over 40 years ago. But my secret reason for going to the Yale School of Management in the early 1980s is that they had a professor who had become a breakout star in the management world, but I knew secretly was not a management expert. She was actually a cultural historian who had written a book about utopian communities called Commitment and Community. And her name was Rosabeth Moss Cantor. And I went to the Yale School of Management because it occurred to me that I could get an MBA studying utopian communities and nobody would be the wiser for it. Unfortunately, Rosabeth left between my 2 years of business school, but we remained close. And when she was creating ALI, I had a kind of front row seat because it's so aligned with the work we were doing at encore.org at that point. So
that's Harvard's equivalent program, the Advanced Leadership Initiative, or ALI.
Yes, although I'm sure that Rosabeth would say that there's no equivalent. And she'd probably be right in most respects. I was interested in these encore education programs like ALI and DCI and others really from the get-go, and really impressed with what was happening at Harvard and ALI. And I would be invited periodically to come back and talk at the reunions for the Yale School of Management. And I'd always advocate that they should do something like that, especially since Rosabeth was a former faculty member there. And I didn't really expect that they would take me up on that. I was just, being provocative, but they did. And the head of executive education there decided that it was something that the Yale School of Management should be doing and invited me to help design and lead the creation of the program.
Okay, so yeah, it's a pretty natural fit. I can imagine if I had you coming back to our school reunions, I would also draw you in without any choice. Sounds like a very obvious fit. But tell us, in your view, you're pretty familiar with them all. What differentiates, if anything, the Yale model? Have you kind of brought over the Harvard model you admired or thrown in a few innovations along your design way?
Well, the program is definitely consistent with what Harvard's doing and Stanford and Notre Dame and Chicago and even the Modern Elder Academy, in the sense that there are three key pillars. We call them looking inward, looking outward, and moving forward, essentially wisdom, purpose, and transitions. But the big differentiation is that the Yale program is a hybrid program for 6 months. And by hybrid, fellows come to Yale at the beginning and end to be in residence at the university, but the rest of the time is virtual. And there are some advantages to doing a hybrid program. Many people that were in the program were still working. They were in the last year. One was a senior partner at a major law firm in his final year. Another fellow was the president of a university. A third, the CEO of a manufacturing. And then other fellows were involved in caregiving roles that required they remain in their home community. So there's greater flexibility for people who aren't in a position to move. And I'm not sure if as many people want to move to New Haven as they do to the San Francisco Bay Area or Cambridge. Yes.
Yeah.
But the other advantage
that
is
must
that
multiply the size of your potential market hugely, because there are so many more people who would like to do these kinds of programs without leaving their jobs for a year.
Exactly. And then the side benefit is also on the cost front. By not having to find housing, in a distant community, people save in that way. And the tuition in the first year for the Yale program was $25,000. So that was, significantly lower than some of the residential programs. I always imagined that somebody could do a program like the ELI fellows at Yale and then decide to do ALI or go directly to grad school or move into a job. So I think it's a way for people, at lower cost and with greater flexibility to get exposed to the midlife transition. And, as Chip Connolly has said to me and talked about this to the advisory board of the program, there's so much space in between efforts like Modern Elder Academy, which is generally a week, and the more intensive residential year-long programs. That said, I think there's a lot to learn from this beta of the ELI fellows about, the trade-offs and the potential improvements that could be made in a hybrid program.
So give us an idea. You've decided to step back from hands-on directing the Yale ELI program for now. Now that it's already launched and you're going to hand it over. So I'm just curious, what did the experience teach you, and how do you think this particular version of it stacks up? What's the advantages and disadvantages?
The timing of your question couldn't be better because, as you say, I'm stepping back from the faculty director role. When I gave those talks to the reunions, I just wanted them to do it. And then when they, it came and asked to help design, I said, sure, that would be terrific. And then I ended up being the faculty director, which was a great experience as well. But I'm still doing my day job at CoGenerate. So at 67, it was tough. But I think the future of that program is really bright, and I'm planning to stay involved through chairing the advisory board and doing other roles to help assist them. But I learned a few different things. One was that the balance between in-person and virtual connection is really important. And the fellows felt strongly that they needed a midpoint connection.
Right.
And I would say
Not
that
just at the beginning and the end, but they have to see each other somewhere in the middle as well.
Exactly, which really aligns with the new program, Imagine pathway that the University of Chicago's LSI program is doing, where it's a year-long program and they're in-person get-togethers for 4 days every 3 months. I think that's the right balance.
It's also designed for people who are staying in work and not taking a year off.
Exactly. And then, related to that is a really important realization that I was counting on, but exceeded my expectations, which is the co-creation role the fellows played They were so interested in improving the program, in taking on roles themselves. One of the fellows who had a master's in positive psychology from Penn that he'd gotten in his 50s brought in weekly speakers to enhance the curriculum. The fellows created a film club, and we brought in film directors and documentarians to talk. They organized informal in-person get-togethers on the East Coast and the West Coast. In every way, the fellows became founding partners of the program. And I think that's something that's not just valuable at the beginning, but will be valuable in perpetuity. So one of the fellows, for example, we created something called Fellow to Fellow. After bringing in all these wise experts from the outside who had a lot of important things to impart, there was this feeling about, what are we, chopped liver? One of the fellows was the featured speaker at South by Southwest in 2024. Bonnie Wan, who wrote the book The Life Brief, which is a terrific book, was featured on the Today Show. We had one fellow interview Bonnie for one of the sessions, and we did that in various iterations. And it was an example of the ways the fellows can be part of the curriculum as well. Okay. So that was a big realization. Another is 6 months is too short. So it raises all these questions about, I felt that of the three pillars of the program of looking inward, kind of personal reflection, oftentimes deferred after long years of working hard and raising families, was foremost in the minds of the fellows. And in the end, they could have spent 6 months just focused on that. And because of that reflection was so long deferred for so many of them. So I feel like the transition, it really does take more than 6 months. And so it raises questions. Could you do a 6-month program akin to what Yale is doing and then have a second 6 months? Could even be an optional component for people who want to retain that kind of structure. So that was another. And then I'm really alert to how many Harvard ALI and Stanford DCI fellows have done the other program, and then in some cases even done the Oxford program, and they're kind of cobbling together a different stage of education. As you've talked about so eloquently, maybe it's a 3-year proposition. So I think figuring out the duration.
Transitions just end up taking a lot longer than anybody thinks when they're going into them. They're usually in a hurry. They want them done like they do when they would like to transition in the 6 month or a year, and then are a little bit taken aback to realize that at this age and stage, it takes a little bit more time to digest where you've been, figure out where you
Yes.
and then start exploring where you want to head next.
Well, it really raises, think about the time we allot young people go to university, they do gap years, they go to graduate school, they have this fitful transition. And then to think that people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s can do it in an expedited period of time after having been so busy for so long. So, and I think it also gets to the point that, a lot of these programs, I think, can be thought of as being, vocational, transactional programs. What are you going to do next? But really, as you know, from firsthand experience, they're every bit as much about who you're going to be next. They're developmental shifts as well as vocational ones in many cases. And that takes longer. It's fitful. And another innovation that I think should be more widespread is combining opportunities to step back and reflect with opportunities to roll up your sleeves and try on different kinds of roles, because what sounds great in the abstract might not be in practice. And so I think that both those aspects are important.
Just like in your 20s, really, until you try.
Yes.
It takes them a long time to give everything a shot. You often just don't know. And I think that's very equivalent later as you reach out into new areas. People just...
I agree. And, it's reflected in the popularity of what in the U.S. are being called co-op ed programs, Northeastern being one of the leaders, where students come for 5 years. Drexel University in Philadelphia is another example. And they do a mix of classroom education and internships. And I think that helps prepare people better for what lies ahead.
Absolutely. And I think that's a little bit what Ann Button is trying to do, if I'm not wrong at
University of Colorado, Denver. Yes, I think Ann Button's program is spectacular. And I'm proud to point out that Ann Button is also an alumnus of the Yale School of Management. We were not there at the same time, but
great minds are obviously formed at Yale. Let's talk a little bit about designing these things for both impact, which is where many of them are, and inclusion. So you've talked about 3 core goals for these programs: affordability, experiential learning, and intergenerational integration. Where do you think we stand on each of those?
Yes, well, we're not doing well on affordability, which is true of higher education in general in the United States. And we're not doing that great on experiential learning. My impetus for trying to develop this combined model of reflection and experimentation came from Stanford DCI fellows who independently became Encore fellows. And so they cobbled together their own co-op education program. And, I think that people who study design thinking say you should look at how people are improvising. And so I think a lot of fellows around the country, or at least some, are cobbling together that kind of experience, but the programs aren't doing it in a robust way. The intergenerational part, similarly, I do not think that was part of the plans for Harvard ELI, for Stanford DCI when they were started, but to the surprise of the founders of those programs, it became a really important feature, and mostly happening through the involvement of the older fellows in the classrooms where they were taking courses, but also being on a campus populated by young people.
Features by both the older fellows and the students involved with them.
Yes, and really a powerful glimpse of what education for a multi-generational society could be like, that really prepared, in the case of young people, how to thrive in an age-diverse world. And similarly for older people, instead of being trained in an age-segregated environment and then thrown into this multi-generational world. So I think there's a lot we could do on that front as well. I did realize that doing a hybrid program makes that much more difficult. The timing of the Yale program, we started in January and ended in June, meant that the fellows were on campus when students weren't there. They were on vacation, but also not having that natural meeting ground of classrooms also made it more difficult. So in the end, I would have liked to do more to consciously build in these kinds of connections. But I think it's terribly important. I think we're just beginning to crawl with these efforts, but at a critical inflection point where we need to move to more accessible models, not in place of great programs like Harvard and Stanford and Chicago, but to complement them, to make these efforts more available in various forms. Or I think you could sour and essentially be viewed as a luxury good for 1% of the population.
So I think, that isn't it interesting to sort of state where we have gotten to as kind of a proof of concept with a very elite, small, experimental group. And now the question is, okay, so how do we scale it and make it much broader, much more global, and much more inclusive? So any ideas, Mark?
Well, I do think that's
You referenced the original elder hostel model. You want to share a bit what that was all about and how did they do it?
My first board member was John Gardner, who we talked about earlier, but my first board chair was Bill Berkeley, who was essentially the founder of Elder Hostel. He didn't have the original idea, but he was the first president and ran it for a quarter century. And the essential idea was putting together 2 things: older people who were hungry to learn but did not feel welcome on campus by young people at that time in the 1970s, and unused dorm space on campuses during the summer. It started at the University of New Hampshire, where older people were recruited to come and live in University of New Hampshire dorms during the summer and take classes. And Bill Berkeley faced a lot of skepticism early on. His former college classmate was the dean of Harvard's Graduate School of Education. And when Bill told this guy about the elder hostel idea, he said, "Oh, that'll never work." But fast forward 2 decades, and elder hostel, which is now called Road Scholar, not only reached millions of older people, it changed the culture around education. People look forward to later life, to retirement as a time to learn and grow. Society's perceptions of what older people want changed. And so I think it was a tremendously important step in the direction of lifelong education, continued by some of the encore education programs we've been talking about. But I think there's a next step that includes some of the features that Elder Hostel pioneered, particularly democratizing and making more readily available these offerings.
So if you were to design public policy to scale and support midlife learning, what would it look like?
Well, I have I don't know if it's the right word, a hobby horse, but there's one idea I keep coming back to because I think this idea itself is necessarily transformative, but as a way to encourage us to start having a debate about how we could make this easier. And that idea is an early year of Social Security or public pension in the US for people who would like to return to school, and potentially in a way where they then deferred getting their full benefits an actuarially equivalent period so that this was roughly cost neutral. And I think it could function like a GI Bill for older people. The GI Bill here in the US ended up enabling millions of people returning from the military service to go to school. And it not only widen the opportunities for higher education, but it changed higher education. It's a time that higher education really needs to change because as many, including our friend Simon Chan, have written, higher ed in the United States at least faces this combined forces of an enrollment cliff, young people, particularly young men, not being as plentiful as they were in the past for college opportunities, and this boom in older people. If we were inventing these higher education institutions in 2025, we would invent them in a different way. But I think what's happening now, especially in the absence of any kind of public policy measure like this early year of Social Security, which I should point out is not my idea solely, that Deb Whitman, the head of public policy at AARP, and I wrote a paper about that together, and she's talked about it in her new book.
And we've done an interview, a podcast with her last season, which we will relink in these show notes along with the link to that article you just referenced.
That's terrific. And another point that Deb makes in that book, which is not directly related to higher ed, but indirectly, which is the prevalence of spare bedrooms in the houses of older people. And there are a number of programs around the country that are focusing on graduate students, young people who are struggling with housing costs, including Nesterly, which was started at MIT, placing those students in the homes of older people. Another in Orange County in California is doing that with students who are homeless, who are living in their cars, which has become a big problem on university campuses. So there are other ways to connect higher ed with the older community as well.
We've got one of those, and we just had that also on our last season in the UK. There's an organization called 2 Generations that is putting people together in housing, shared housing. So yeah, that's a bit of a boom. But I want you to get on to, so step back a bit for me. And we know that these midlife programs are, as you say, in sort of midlife 1.0. How do you see this first generation, if you were to kind of summarize it, and where do you think we're headed? We know higher ed's going to change. We know the demographic shape is changing. They're not matched anymore. So where are we, and where do you give us a bit of crystal ball? Where are we going?
Okay, well, I would even step back on the crystal ball and say that this all fits into the context, not just of the longevity boom and the aging of society, but the change in the life course that's underway. Laura Carstensen and Stanford have been talking about a new map of life. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Big Shift, which was about the invention of life stages. And I believe this new stage is taking shape in the period between the middle years and anything representing retirement and old age. And it needs its own kind of education.
On our 4 Quarter Lives podcast.
Exactly. It's very much in line with what the podcast is talking about. And, it's interesting. One of the first people to recognize the development of this new stage of life was Carl Jung, who in 1929 wrote an essay called The Stages of Life. And he argued that this new period was taking shape. And he said it needed a new kind of education. And there's a much cited quote that I'm sure you know well, in which Jung said, "You can't live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning." And that if you try to do that, it's not going to end well. But it shouldn't be a do-it-yourself project. He asked where the colleges for 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds, and I think if he was alive today, he would say 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds. There are none, is how he concludes that passage. And I think that what we're seeing with the encore education programs is a response to the there are none. Now there are some. And there are other developments that are happening on campus too that are important. The university-based retirement community movement, oftentimes intersecting with learning like at Mirabella at Arizona State. Then there are other efforts. We're involved with a group called Campus Compact, which promotes community service and social impact among college students, doing a project called Campus CoGenerate, which is bringing older people from the community together with students to work on the challenges that their locations are facing. There's so many creative illustrations of how the generations can be brought together with campuses as a locus, but they remain piecemeal. You got an ALI here, you have a Mirabella there, there's a Campus CoGenerate, someplace else. What would it look like if we were to create a critical mass of these efforts and ultimately create an institution that was designed not just to serve young people and bring in older people around the margins, but to really rethink what education for a long life and for a multi-generational future looks like.
So let's go there and let's conclude there with the sort of future. Let's just go. Come on, Mark. The future of higher ed in an era of longevity will be the title of our conclusion. And I'm curious, you've said a lot of these programs remain somewhat marginal, even in the universities that are hosting them. What would it take, and what do you think it'll look like for higher ed to take this whole longevity revolution much more seriously? When is it actually going to drive strategy?
Well, I think it's likely to come. First of all, I think we need a period of experimentation that's more comprehensive. We've had a period of piecemeal experimentation, and that's gone well and captured people's imagination and built demand, not just in the United States, but as you've charted all over the globe. But now I think we need more fundamental rethinking. And I think the places it's likely to start are not the Harvards and Yales and Stanfords of the world, but in one area are smaller colleges, which are struggling with the enrollment cliff and oftentimes live in communities where there's a big older population. I'm going next week to one of those campuses. I won't say the name, but it's really thinking in a fundamental way how to create a multi-generational model for education.
So you think it'll basically take survival reality? There are other or die contexts where otherwise they go down because basically there are no more young people.
I think so. I think you've accurately characterized the situation. I might say, places where they see an economic opportunity as well. There's not only the survival threat, but there's a chance to pioneer something that's economically not just viable, but powerful. A second place I think that this could happen are in state universities, not necessarily the elite, University of Michigan or Berkeley, but in California, for example, we have a Cal State system, which is quite reasonably priced. I have a daughter at one of the campuses right now, and when I've looked at the demographics for these universities, they are quite age diverse already. but there aren't efforts to lean into that. It's become a phenomenon. Older people are taking courses, but I think the people are already there,
right?
And there's so much more that can be done.
An unconscious kind of melting pot of ages, but not a strategic response or a intergenerational weaving of what they could build together more consciously.
Yes, I agree. And then, most of all, I think whatever the setting, we need some schools that are the shining cities on the hill that really show a more comprehensive approach in the way that ALI, Harvard ALI, and Stanford DCI did for these encore education programs. They really captured the public imagination and started to proliferate. I think the next generation needs to be higher ed institutions that have figured out a more fundamental way to do this and could play that same catalytic role that ALI and DCI and others are playing in the year-long education realm.
I'm curious to see, who do you think in the higher ed space will be the catalyst to do this? I mean, we discussed a bit. Is it going to be the university administration, the presidents? Is it going to be business schools or the divinity, humanities, faculties trying to wake us up to the potential of our longer lives? It's very interesting because all these different schools and midlife programs currently have their origins in different parts of the university, not usually the university launching the effort.
Yes. Well, I think it'll be a combination. One of the really heartening experiences with the Yale ELI program is the role that Divinity School played in the program. They have a Life Worth Living initiative. And so in some ways, a business school and a divinity school seem like odd companions, but it worked together beautifully. So that, some of it will be...
It works, Mark. If only each could balance out the other.
Exactly. But, the other probably even more important element is just leadership. When you think about the programs that have thrived so far, the leaders have come from different... Rosebeth Kenner is a business school professor with a background in utopian communities. Phil Pizzo, who created the Stanford effort, is the dean of the medical school there. And, the University of Chicago, Seth Green runs the general education focused Graham School. So, people who are spearheading these initiatives seem to be coming from a lot of different backgrounds, but they're interdisciplinary, creative thinkers who have sway within the institutions. So I think the question, though, if you go to the economics, I think a lot of the universities that were persuaded to start this generation of programs were attracted to the idea of getting a new group of donors through. And I think that's probably been realized. Is there the appetite to attract people like me who aren't likely to be significant donors? And so that remains to be seen.
So we're back to the do or die kind of argument until they really have to, and until there's no demographic choice other than reshaping universities for a different generational balance. You think this is going to stay pretty marginal?
I hope not, because, I do think there's this pioneering sociologist, the first head of research at the National Institute of Aging, the late Matilda White Riley, and she had this idea of structural lag. She said that, people's lives changed ahead of the culture and the institutional framework, and then those caught up. I'm hoping that we don't have too long a lag, because there are people who are essentially going and enrolling in schools and cobbling together another chapter of education because they need it and they're living longer lives. And the idea of loading all your education for a 100-year life into the 18 to 25 period doesn't make any sense. So I do think that there will be visionary leaders in higher education and elsewhere that start creating new models, just like the Rosebeth Cantors and Phil Pizzos did in this area. So I would say on balance, optimistic, but it's probably going to be a bumpy ride.
Fantastic. Mark, I can't thank you enough for your overview of where we stand. I want to end perhaps just where we began. You've been on this for many a decade, all of these themes of lifelong learning, midlife transitions, connecting intergenerationally. As you emerge now into sort of the end of what I call Q3, Any ideas? What's next for you? Are you going to keep going on your 40-year effort, or do you think there are new chapters in you now that you've founded a school and program on transitions? Any ideas?
Well, I'm interested in two things that are closely related. I'm trying to write a new book, which is focused on age segregation and how we got so compartmentalized by age since the beginning of the 20th century, because I think we focused a lot on ageism, which is terribly important. But age segregation, I think, is one of the most important arrangements feeding ageism and a whole set of other problems, including conflict and loneliness. So I'm trying to get to the bottom of how we became segregated by age. And related to that, through the CoGenerate work, we're really we believe that cross-generational connection and collaboration is an important part of social capital. It's a distinctive part. And yet we lack the social infrastructure to create that kind of social capital. The social infrastructure we've created around later life, senior centers, nursing homes, retirement communities, by and large, are designed to separate older people. Can we build robust social infrastructure designed to bring the generations together, particularly to do things together? So those are the two questions that I'm very much focused on these days.
It's a wonderful end. When you were really young, you were pushing for intergenerational connections. And now as you age, you'll be just on the flip side of that coin and still pushing the same message. Marc, thank you for everything you're doing and for being with us to share it.
It was a joy. Thank you, Avivah.
We'll be back soon with your new book, I understand.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Good luck with it. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye.
For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.